Welcome to my channel.
The rain in Loch Dhu did not fall so much as it drifted, a fine grey haar that clung to the heather and turned the peat-brown waters of the loch into a sheet of dull pewter. It was the kind of morning that invited a man to stay in bed with a thick woolen blanket and a book of poetry, but PC Hamish Macbeth had more practical matters on his mind. Specifically, he was thinking about a salmon. Hamish stood by the bend of the Ndhu River, his tall, lanky frame partially obscured by a cluster of dripping rowan trees. His shock of red hair was tucked under a tattered cap, and his hazel eyes were fixed with predatory intensity on a silver ripple in the current. In his hand was a stout rod, and in his pocket was the quiet satisfaction of knowing that the local fishery warden, Mr. Johnson, was currently 3 miles away, nursing a dyspeptic stomach and a grudge against the humidity. "Just one, Lugs," Hamish whispered to the flop-eared mongrel sitting patiently at his heels. "A modest fish for a modest man. The law is a grand thing, but it doesna fill the stomach on a Tuesday." Lugs gave a soft, cynical huff. He had heard this justification before. The peace of the Highlands, however, was a fragile thing, easily shattered by the intrusion of the internal combustion engine. The roar of a high-performance Italian sports car echoed across the glen, a sound as alien to Loch Dhu as a spaceship. Hamish winced as the scream of the engine climbed the narrow road toward the village, followed by the screech of brakes that suggested the driver had more money than sense. Hamish sighed, wound in his line, and began the trek back toward the police station. Duty, like the rain, was inevitable. When he reached the village square, a crowd of locals had already gathered near the Loch Dhu Hotel. The source of the commotion was a gleaming cherry-red Ferrari, now parked at an aggressive angle across 2 spaces. Emerging from the driver's seat was a man who looked like he had been manufactured in a factory for insufferable Sassenachs. He wore a cream-coloured linen suit, entirely inappropriate for the Highland damp, and a pair of sunglasses that likely cost more than Hamish's annual salary. "Is there no one in this god-forsaken outpost who can carry a bag?" the man demanded, his voice a sharp-clipped London accent that carried effortlessly through the misty air. Mrs. Gallo, the postmistress, leaned against her shop door, her arms folded. "We've a porter, Mr. Sterling, but he's a man, not a pack mule, and he's currently having his tea—" "Incompetence," Julian Sterling spat, flicking a speck of mud from his sleeve with an expression of profound disgust. He turned his gaze toward Hamish, who was approaching with his rod broken down, and his uniform jacket looking suspiciously damp. "You, constable, I assume you're the law here, such as it is. Secure this vehicle. I don't want any of the locals, livestock, scratching the paint." Hamish put on his most vacant, wide-eyed expression, the one that usually convinced outsiders he was several bricks short of a full load. He tilted his head, giving Sterling a slow, toothy grin. "Och, it's a braw carser, right shiny, though the sheep hereabouts have a terrible habit of rubbing their itchy backs against anything red. Reminds them of a sunset, I suppose." Sterling's face paled slightly. "That's ridiculous." "Is it now?" Hamish asked mildly, leaning against a stone wall. "Well, I'll keep a wandering eye on it. Provided it's legally parked, of course, which it isn't. But seeing as you're new, we'll call it a Highland welcome." Sterling didn't thank him. He merely scoffed and marched into the hotel, leaving a scent of expensive cologne and misplaced superiority in his wake. Hamish watched him go, the smile fading from his eyes. He didn't like Julian Sterling. Sterling was a property developer who had recently purchased the Widow's Rest, a secluded Victorian villa on the edge of the cliffs. He had already ruffled feathers by threatening to close off an ancient right-of-way path used by the locals for centuries. "A nasty piece of work," a voice said. Hamish turned to see Priscilla Halberton Smythe, the daughter of the local gentry, looking as elegant as ever in a barber jacket and Wellingtons. "He's got plans, Priscilla," Hamish said, his voice dropping its staged lilt. "He wants to turn the rest into a bespoke wellness retreat, which, in Loch Dhu terms, means a place for rich folk to be miserable in private." "He's already fired the local cleaning staff," Priscilla noted. "He says they're insubordinate. I think he just doesn't like anyone looking him in the eye." "Aye," Hamish muttered, looking back at the red Ferrari. "A man who hates to be looked at usually has a reason." It's a pity he's ruined the morning. I had a date with a salmon. The salmon is probably safer than Mr. Sterling, Priscilla said darkly. The village is talking, Hamish, and when Loch Dhu talks, someone usually ends up sorry. Hamish nodded, a cold prickle of intuition dancing down his spine. The rain continued to fall, grey and silent over the hills of Sutherland. The following morning did nothing to improve the temperament of the sky, or the residents of Loch Dhu. The mist had thickened into a soup-like fog that swallowed the peaks of Sullivan and Canisp, leaving the village feeling like a ghost ship adrift in the Atlantic. Hamish Macbeth had spent a restless night in the police station, his sleep disturbed by dreams of red Ferraris and the indignant bleating of sheep. He was nursing a mug of grey, lukewarm coffee, and considering the merits of a second breakfast, when the telephone on his desk let out a shrill, demanding ring that set lugs to barking. Hamish stared at the instrument with profound suspicion. Calls at 8 in the morning rarely involved invitations to a shielet or news of a lottery win. Wit. A sigh of resignation, he raised the receiver. Loch Dhu Police Station. PC Macbeth speaking, he drawled, leaning back until his chair groaned in protest. Hamish, it's Mrs. Wellington. The voice of the minister's wife was several octaves higher than usual, vibrating with a mixture of horror and a distinct, underlying tremor of excitement. You must come at once to the Widow's Rest. It's the Sassenach, the property man. Mr. Sterling, has he found a scratch on his paintwork, Mrs. Wellington? Hamish asked, reaching for his notebook with a slow, deliberate movement. I warned him about the sheep, you'll remember. He's past worrying about scratches, Hamish. He's in the garden, or rather, he's in the decorative fountain he'd installed last week, the one with the marble dolphins. He's quite dead, and he's wearing the most extraordinary thing. Hamish was out the door in under a minute, his lazy persona discarded in the privacy of the fog. He whistled for lugs, scrambled into his battered Land Rover, and navigated the twisting cliff road with the practised ease of a man who knew every pothole by its first name. The Widow's Rest sat perched on a jagged promontory, a grim Victorian edifice that seemed to scowl at the sea. As Hamish pulled up the gravel drive, he saw Mrs. Wellington standing by the gates, clutching her cardigan to her throat, her face the colour of wet parchment. In there, she whispered, pointing toward the centre of the manicured lawn. Hamish Wall cared across the grass, his boots sinking into the sodden turf. The fountain was a garish affair, out of place against the rugged Highland backdrop. In the centre of the shallow basin, draped over the spray nozzles of 2 leaping dolphins, was Julian Sterling. The man who had been so fastidious about his linen suit the day before was now a study in damp humiliation. He was stone dead, his sightless eyes staring up at the leaden sky, but it was his attire that gave the scene its bizarre, macabre quality. Sterling was dressed in a full traditional Highland outfit, kilt, sporran, ghillie brogues, and a heavy tweed jacket. But the kilt was a cheap acrylic tourist tartan of no particular clan, and it had been put on backward. To add a final, insulting touch, a large, plastic See You Jimmy hat with synthetic ginger hair was jammed firmly down over his ears. Hamish knelt by the edge of the fountain, careful not to disturb the surrounding gravel. He didn't need a medical degree to see the cause of death. There was a heavy, purplish bruise at the base of Sterling's skull, and the water in the basin was tinged with a faint, pinkish hue. "Och, Mr. Sterling," Hamish murmured, his voice soft with a pity the man would have despised in life. "You wanted to own the Highlands, and now they've gone and dressed you up like a souvenir shop." He looked around the garden. The fog acted as a muffler, but it also acted as a shroud. Anyone could have come up the back path from the village, struck the blow, and vanished into the Har without being seen. He checked the body's pockets. They were empty, save for a single crumpled receipt from the local chemist for indigestion tablets and a small silver key that didn't look like it belonged to a car or a house. Lugs wandered over to a nearby rhododendron bush and began to growl, a low rumbling sound deep in his throat. Hamish followed the dog's gaze. Tucked under the leaves was a heavy cast-iron garden gnome, its cheerful painted face smeared with something dark and sticky. It was a common enough object, the kind of thing Sterling would have found tacky, yet here it was, serving as a makeshift bludgeon. Right then, Hamish sighed, standing up and wiping his hands on his trousers. That's the end of my quiet week. He knew what came next. He would have to call it into Strathbane. Within 2 hours, the narrow roads would be choked with white vans, forensic technicians in paper suits, and the inevitable roaring presence of Detective Chief Inspector Blair. Blair would hate the fog, he would hate the smell of peat, and he would most certainly hate Hamish Macbeth for being the one to find the body. Hamish looked back at the house. A curtain flickered in an upper window. Sterling had mentioned firing the local staff, but he hadn't mentioned who he had kept on. The property developer had been a man of secrets, hidden behind a veneer of wealth and arrogance. Now, he was just a prop in a dark comedy, a man who had insulted to... He wronged people in a land that never forgot a slight. "Stay, lugs," Hamish ordered, sitting on a stone bench a respectful distance from the fountain. He pulled a thermos of tea from his large coat pocket. He knew he should be cordoning off the area, but there was no one around to contaminate it but the seagulls, and they were notoriously tight-lipped. He sat silently listening. He listened to the waves crashing against the cliffs below, the drip of water from the rowan trees, and the distant rhythmic thud of a boat's engine on the loch. It was in these moments of forced stillness that Hamish did his best work. He wasn't looking for fingerprints, he was looking for the shape of the anger that had led to this. To dress a man as a mockery of the culture he had insulted required more than just a murderous impulse. It required a sense of theatrical justice. As the distant wail of a police siren finally cut through the mist, signalling Blair's approach, Hamish took a slow sip of his tea. The peace of Loch Dhu had been shattered, and his own comfortable, lazy existence was about to be trampled by the boots of the Strathbane CID. He had a feeling that the CU Jimmy hat was only the first of many insults this case would offer. He closed his eyes for a second, memorizing the smell of the damp earth and the exact angle of the gnome, before the world of shouting men and flashing lights descended upon his quiet glen. The sirens did not so much approach Loch Dhu as they assaulted it, a high-pitched wail bouncing off the granite cliffs and sending the local sheep into a frantic woolly stampede. Hamish Macbeth stood by the gates of the Widow's Rest, his hands shoved deep into his pockets, watching as a convoy of white and blue cars screeched up the gravel drive, scattering stones like shrapnel. At the head of the procession was a black sedan that pulled up so sharply it nearly clipped Hamish's shins. Out tumbled Detective Chief Inspector Blair, his face already a shade of alarming crimson that suggested his blood pressure was currently rivaling the steam pressure of a Victorian locomotive. Blair hated the Highlands, he hated the narrow roads, he hated the smell of damp wool, and most of all, he hated the sight of PC Hamish Macbeth standing peacefully in the middle of a crime scene. "Macbeth!" Blair roared, his voice cracking with the strain of his own indignation. He slammed the car door and stomped toward the fountain, his heavy shoes squelching in the mud. "Explain this. What in God's name is this? This thing in the water, is this some Highland joke? Have you been playing dress-up with a corpse?" Hamish widened his eyes, adopting a look of profound, slow-witted bewilderment. He pulled his tattered cap lower over his brow and gestured vaguely with a long, bony finger. "Oh, no, sir. I found him just like that. Mr. Julian Sterling he was, or is. It's a terrible business surely. The CU Jimmy hat was already quite firmly attached when I arrive. D on the scene. I thought it best not to touch it, lest I disturb the dignity of the deceased." Blair stared at the body of the property developer, who was still draped ignominiously over the marble dolphins. He took the retro kilt and synthetic orange hair of the novelty hat, his lip curled in a sneer of pure contempt. "Dignity? The man looks like a prize idiot. And you've been sitting here drinking tea while a killer is likely halfway to Inverness. Why isn't this area cordoned off? Why haven't you secured the perimeter?" "The perimeter is mostly cliffs and bog, Inspector," Hamish replied mildly, his voice trailing off into a soft Highland lilt. "Lugs and I have been keeping an eye on the only road. Unless the killer can fly or swim like a seal, he's still somewhere in the parish. But I did find the weapon, I think, over by the rhododendrons." He pointed to the cast-iron garden gnome. Blair marched over to it, looming over the painted figure with a scowl. "A gnome? You're telling me a professional property developer was done in by a lawn ornament? This is the kind of backwater nonsense that makes my life a misery, Macbeth. It's pathetic. It's small time. It's probably just some local drunk who didn't like the man's car. Blair's team, including the weary-looking DS Jimmy Anderson and a fresh-faced constable who looked ready to be sick, began to unload crates of forensic equipment. They moved with a frantic, misplaced energy, trampling over the very patches of grass SS Hamish had been careful to avoid. Anderson wandered over to Hamish, smelling faintly of stale cigarettes and cheap peppermint. "Any ideas, Hamish?" Anderson whispered, leaning in so Blair wouldn't hear. "The chief is in a foul mood. His wife's mother is visiting, and he was looking for any excuse to get out of the house, but a murder in a fountain wasn't exactly what he had in mind." "He wasn't alike, Jimmy," Hamish said softly, his eyes tracking Blair as the DCI began shouting orders at the forensic photographer. Sterling wanted to fence off the old paths. He'd already sacked half the village from his payroll. But the way he's dressed, that's not just a killing, that's a statement. Someone wanted to make him look like the fool he thought the Highlanders were. "Macbeth," Blair's voice cut through the fog again, "stop whispering like a pair of washerwomen. Get yourself down to the village. I want a list of every able-bodied man who's had a run-in with Sterling in the last 48 hours. Which, from what I hear, is probably the entire population of this miserable hole. And stay out of our way. We're doing real police work here, not poaching salmon or whatever it is you do in your spare time." Hamish nodded obediently, his face a mask of humble compliance. "Of course, Inspector, a list. I'll get right on it. Would you be wanting me to check the hotel register as well? There's a few outsiders staying there who might have followed Mr. Sterling up from London. I don't Eat your advice, you tall drink of water," Blair snapped, waving a dismissive hand. "Go, shoo, take that flea-bitten mongrel with you before it leaves evidence on the lawn. I'll have this solved by tea time. It'll be one of the locals. Some disgruntled crofter with a grudge and a heavy hand. It always is." Hamish whistled for lugs and began to retreat toward his Land Rover. He didn't mind being dismissed. In fact, he preferred it. When Blair was in charge, the villagers clammed up, their faces turning to stone and their tongues becoming tied in knots. They saw the Strathbane police as an invading army, loud and arrogant, and entirely ignorant of the subtle, shifting alliances of the North. To them, Blair was a Sassenach in spirit, if not in birth, a man who didn't understand that in Lochdu a secret was a commodity more valuable than gold. As he climbed into the driver's seat, Hamish looked back at the house one last time. He saw the forensic team swarming the fountain, their white suits vivid against the grey stone. They were looking for DNA, fibre, cold, hard science facts. But Hamish knew that the answer wouldn't be found in a test tube. It would be found in the tea rooms and the bars, in the things people whispered when they thought the police weren't listening, and in the peculiar petty motives that drove a person to dress a dead man in a backward kilt. "Well, lugs," Hamish said, turning the key in the ignition. The Land Rover coughed and sputtered into life. "The big men are here to show us how it's done, which means we can go and have ourselves a proper look at the village. I think we'll start with the post office. Mrs. Gallo usually knows who's been buying ginger wigs and who's been nursing a sore head." The Land Rover crashed the drive, leaving the chaos of the official investigation. Hamish felt the familiar, slow hum of a mystery beginning to settle in his bones. Blair could have the credit, cameras and paperwork. Hamish just wanted to know why Julian Sterling had died with a smile of plastic ginger hair on his head. And more importantly, he wanted to ensure that whoever had done it didn't ruin the peace of his beloved Lochdur for longer than was strictly necessary. He drove slowly, his eyes scanning the mist, already listening for the silence that usually preceded a lie. The Land Rover rattled into the heart of Lochdur, its engine sounding like a bag of nails being shaken by a giant. But to Hamish it was the sound of safety. He parked the vehicle in front of the post office, carefully avoiding the space where Sterling's Ferrari still sat like a blood-red scar against the grey pavement. The village was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that usually meant every pair of eyes was peering through a gap in the curtains. Hamish knew the drill. Blair would be stomping through the village soon enough, barking questions and frightening the elderly, which meant Hamish had a narrow window to gather the truth before it was buried under a lay. Of Highland stubbornness. He entered the post office, the bell above the door giving a cheerful tinkle that felt entirely inappropriate given the morning's discoveries. Mrs. Gallo was behind the counter, her spectacles perched on the tip of her nose as she meticulously sorted a pile of pension books. She didn't look up, but the set of her shoulders told Hamish she was primed for a long session of not knowing anything. "It's a damp one, Mrs. Gallo," Hamish said, leaning his elbows on the counter and letting his long limbs settle into a posture of relaxed indolence. "I don't suppose you've a drop of tea on the go?" "My throat is as dry as a lime-burner's hat after dealing with the big folk from Strathbane." Mrs. Gallo huffed, a sharp sound that blew a stray hair out of her eyes. "I heard they've arrived, screeching through the village like they're chasing the devil himself. And poor Mr. Stirling, they say he was found in a fountain. Is it true, Hamish? Was he really dressed up like a common tourist?" Hamish sighed, his expression one of mournful regret. "Aye, it's true enough. A sad sight for a man of his standing. A backward kilt, and one of those ginger wigs from the shop in Leg. It makes a man wonder who would go to such trouble. It's not just a murder, you see, it's an insult. And an insult usually requires a person who feels they've been insulted first." Mrs. Gallo paused, her hand hovering over a stamp. She looked toward the frosted glass of the front door to ensue. No one was lurking, then leaned in close. "He was a wicked man, Hamish. Do you know he came in here, only Tuesday past, demanding I stop taking personal parcels for the Crofters. Said it was an inefficient use of a Crown office. He wanted everything digitized, whatever that means. He even had a go at young Peter the postie for being 5 minutes late with the London papers." "Is that so?" Hamish asked, his voice a low, encouraging murmur. "And did Peter take it well? He's a sensitive lad, is he no?" He was shaking, Hamish, but it wasn't just Peter. Stirling had been to curry shop too, told Mr. Patel that the smell of turmeric was devaluing the local air quality. The man had no soul, Hamish. He looked at us like we were just dirt on his expensive Italian shoes. Hamish nodded, absorbing the information without writing a word in his notebook. He knew that the moment he produced a pen, the flow of gossip would dry up. He spent the next 20 minutes mooching a ginger biscuit and another cup of tea, listening as Mrs. Gallo detailed the various grievances the village held against the deceased. It seemed Stirling had managed to offend the minister by suggesting the church bells were a noise nuisance, and he had infuriated the local blacksmith by claiming a right to a strip of land where the smithy had stood for a century. But the ginger wig Mrs. Gallo, Hamish prompted gently. "That's a specific thing. You wouldn't happen to have sold one lately." "Not me," she said firmly. "But old Geordie at the hardware store keeps a few in the back for the Highland games. He says the tourists love them. Although I did see Mrs. McLean's nephew, the one who's staying for the summer, carrying a bright orange bag yesterday. He looked very shifty, if you ask me. But then, all youngsters look shifty these days with their trousers hanging off their hips." Hamish thanked her and moved on to the Lochdu Hotel, where the smell of frying bacon greeted him like an old friend. He found Nellie, the cook, in the kitchen, her face red from the heat of the stove. She was a woman who saw everything and forgot nothing. Within 10 minutes, Hamish was seated at the corner of the wooden table with a plate of buttered toast and a fresh pot of coffee. "He was at it again last night, Hamish," Nellie whispered, wiping her hands on her apron. "Stirling. He was in the bar bragging about how he was going to turn the Widow's Rest into a club for high-net-worth individuals. He said Lochdu was a dying museum, and he was the one to give it a decent burial. Then he had a row with a man in the corner. A tall man looked like he'd spent time in the sun. They were arguing about money, I think. Something about a partnership that went sour. Did you get a name, Nellie?" "No, but he's staying in room 4. Checked in under the name Smith, which is as good as saying he's an outlaw in these parts. He left early this morning, before the fog lifted. Didn't even wait for his kippers. Hamish chewed his toast thoughtfully. A mysterious partner, a village full of people with bruised pride, and a DCI currently trying to arrest the local blacksmith for having menacing-looking hammers. The investigation was widening, but the core of it remained the same. Julian Stirling had been a man who trampled over the lives of others until someone decided to trample back. As he left the hotel, the fog seemed to lift just enough to reveal DCI Blair's black sedan parked outside the police station. The big men were back from the cliffside, no doubt looking for someone to shout at. Hamish felt a familiar weariness. He had the names and the motives, but he needed the soul of the crime. He needed to know why the kilt was backward. In the Highlands, Every detail meant something, and a backward kilt was more than a joke. It was a sign of someone being cast out, a ritualistic shaming that hinted at a much deeper, older grudge than a simple business deal gone wrong. He whistled for Lugs, who was busy sniffing a discarded crisp packet, and began to walk toward the station, his mind already weaving together the threads of the village's collective anger. He would have to be careful. If he solved this too quickly, Blair would have him promoted to a desk in Inverness before the week was out, and Hamish had no intention of leaving his loch, his mountains, or his poached salmon for the sake of a career. He would have to move like the hare, silent, pervasive, and seemingly there for no reason. The heavy tread of Blair's boots echoed inside the police station, but Hamish lingered on the threshold, his gaze drifting toward a silver Volvo that had just pulled into the lot. Priscilla Halberton-Smythe stepped out, her golden hair damp from the hair, looking as if she had been carved from the very atmosphere of the Highlands. She didn't approach the station door. Instead, she leaned against her car and waited, a signal Hamish knew well. He detoured away from the impending shouting match with Blair, slipping around the side of the building to meet her. In the hierarchy of Loch Dhu, Priscilla was his most valuable asset, moving in circles where people spoke of investments and estates rather than crofts and pensions. "You look like a man who's had too much tea and not enough answers, Hamish," she said softly, her eyes searching his face. "I heard about the costume. It's all over the village. My father is horrified, of course, but mostly because he thinks the kilt was a polyester blend. It's a nasty business, Priscilla," Hamish replied, his voice dropping into its natural, more intelligent register, now that the local bobby mask could be lowered. "Blair is convinced it's a disgruntled villager, someone like the blacksmith or the postie. He sees the 'See you Jimmy' hat and thinks it's a prank that went too far. But there's a coldness to it that bothers me. To dress a man after he's dead, to fix that hat on his head while his blood is cooling, that takes a specific kind of steady hand." Priscilla nodded, her expression becoming serious. "I might have something that helps. I met Julian Sterling at a dinner party in London last spring, before he bought the rest. He wasn't just a developer, Hamish, he was a vulture capitalist. He specialized in buying historic properties that were tied up in complicated family trusts, breaking the trusts through legal loopholes, and then gutting the houses for high-end resale. But there was a rumor that he hadn't done the latter alone. He'd burned a partner, someone who had deep roots in the north. Hamish thought of the man in room 4, the mysterious Mr. Smith who had left his kippers untouched. A partner? Nellie mentioned a tall man with a tan arguing with him at the hotel last night. Did this partner have a name? "The name I heard was Harrison, but he wouldn't be using that if he were looking for revenge," Priscilla said, stepping closer to avoid being overheard by the forensic team loading vans nearby. "But here's the thing, Hamish. Sterling didn't just take the money. He humiliated the man. He made it look like the partner had embezzled the funds, ruining his reputation in the city. In those circles, social death is often worse than the real thing. It's why the fountain costume feels so familiar. It wasn't just a joke, it was a mirror. Whoever did it was saying, 'You made me a laughingstock, so now it's your turn.'" Hamish leaned his back against the cold stone of the station wall. "A mere raw," he mused. "That would explain the backward kilt. In the old days, to wear your colours incorrectly was a sign of a man who had no clan, a man who had forfeited his honour. If the killer is this partner, he's a man with a sense of history, or at least a sense of irony. There's one more thing," Priscilla added, her voice a mere whisper. "I saw Elspeth Grant earlier. She's been doing some research for her newspaper on the history of the Widow's Rest. She told me that the villa wasn't always called that. It was originally the Highland Rose, owned by a family who lost everything in a property scandal 30 years ago. The name was changed after the owner's wife threw herself from the cliffs. Elspeth thinks Sterling didn't buy that house by accident. He liked the pedigree of tragedy." Hamish felt the pieces of the puzzle shifting, clicking into a pattern that was far more complex than the simple, angry local theory Blair was currently pursuing. He saw the connection now, the silver key in Sterling's pocket, the tall man in the hotel, and the specific, ritualistic nature of the body's presentation. It wasn't about a right-of-way or a noisy church bell. Those were the grievances of the village, the smoke that hid the fire. The fire itself was something much older and more personal. "Thank you, Priscilla," Hamish said, reaching out to touch her hand briefly. "You've given me more to chew on than a week's worth of Nellie's steak and kidney pie. I'd best go and face the music. Blair will be wondering why I'm out here dallying with the gentry instead of harassing the locals. Be careful, Hamish," she warned. "A man who thinks in symbols is much more dangerous than a man who thinks in fists. Whoever did that to Sterling didn't just want him dead, they wanted him erased." As Priscilla drove away, Hamish turned back to the station, his mind racing. He needed to find Elspeth and see what else she had uncovered about the history of the house, but first he had to survive DCI Blair. He pushed open the door and was immediately met by a wall of tobacco smoke and the sound of Blair slamming a telephone receiver down. "There you are," Blair bellowed, his face now a deep, bruised purple. "I've been looking for you for 20 minutes, while you've been out whispering to your fancy girlfriend. I've been doing actual police work. We've found our man, Macbeth. It's that young postman, Peter. We found a bright orange bag in his locker at the sorting office, and a receipt for a See You Jimmy hat from a shop in Lairg. He's in the interview room now, and I'm about to break him. You can stay and watch if you want to see how a real detective operates, though try not to breathe too loudly. You might distract me." Hamish felt a sinking sensation in his stomach. Peter was a shy, nervous lad who would confess to the Great Fire of London if Blair shouted at him long enough. The orange bag Mrs. Gallo had mentioned was the smoking gun, but Hamish knew it was too easy. It was too neat. A man like the one Priscilla described wouldn't leave a receipt in a locker. He would leave a trail of breadcrumbs for someone like Blair to follow, ensuring the real culprit vanished back into the mist. He looked at Blair's triumphant, sweating face and realized he had very little time to find the truth before an innocent boy's life was ruined. He would have to play the fool one more time, nodding and smiling while he looked for the one thing Blair always missed, the motive that made sense of the madness. Hamish stood at the back of the cramped interview room, blending into the shadows of the wood-panelled walls while DCI Blair leaned over the table, his shadow looming like a dark cloud over young Peter Macpherson. The boy was trembling, his eyes red-rimmed and fixed on the floor. On the table between them sat the orange plastic bag and the damning receipt for the novelty hat, looking absurdly bright under the harsh fluorescent light. Blair was in his element, his voice a low, menacing rumble that occasionally erupted into a shout. "We know he humiliated you, Peter," Blair sneered, tapping the receipt with a thick, stubby finger. "He called you incompetent. He threatened your job. You went to Lairg, you bought this ridiculous hat, and you went up to that house to give him a piece of your mind. Things got out of hand, didn't they? You hit him with the gnome, and then you thought you'd have a laugh by dressing him up. Just a bit of Highland justice, eh, bruh? I did brr. I swear." Peter's voice cracked. "I did buy the hat, but it was for my nephew's birthday party. He loves those silly things. I never even went to the rest last night. I was at home with my mother watching the telly. Your mother is 80 and half-blind, boy. She wouldn't know if you were in the room or in Timbuktu." Blair slammed his hand on the table, making Peter jump. "It's over. Sign the statement, and maybe the judge will go easy on a simpleton from the sticks." Hamish watched Peter's resolve crumbling. The boy was seconds away from a false confession, just to escape the terrifying heat of Blair's proximity. Hamish knew he had to intervene, but doing so directly would only invite Blair's wrath and solidify his determination to make the arrest. He needed a way to pull the rug out from under the DCI's perfect case, without appearing to do so. "Excuse me, Inspector," Hamish piped up, his voice sounding particularly airy and slow. "I was just wondering about that receipt there. It's a fine bit of evidence, surely, but I noticed something odd when I was mooching about the post office earlier." Blair turned, his face darkening to a shade of plum. "What is it now, Macbeth? Can't you see I'm conducting a high-level interrogation? Go back to your dog." "Oh, it's just a small thing, sir," Hamish said, stepping forward with a look of feigned confusion. "But Peter here delivers the mail to the hardware shop in Lairg every morning, does he not? And Geordie, who runs the shop, is a stickler for the rules. He always prints the time on those receipts. That one there says 10:15 a.m. on Monday. But Monday morning Peter was right here in Lochdu helping Mrs. Gallo with the heavy sorting because the van had broken down. I remember seeing him through the window while I was, inspecting the pavement." Blair snatched the receipt, squinting at the faint purple ink. So he bought it another time. It doesn't prove a thing. But there's the rub, sir, Hamish continued mildly. If Peter was here, he couldn't have been in Leg. And more importantly, Peter's orange bag, the one you found in his locker, has a tear in the handle. I saw it when he was carrying his lunch yesterday. That bag on the table is brand new, not a scratch on it. It's almost as if someone wanted us to find a bag and a receipt that looked just like Peter's, but forgot that the real Peter is a lad who looks after his pennies and reuses his bags until they fall apart. Blair looked from the bag to the receipt and then back to the terrified boy. He knew Hamish was right, but admitting it felt like swallowing glass. He threw the receipt in disgust. Fine! So the timing is off. It's still his hat. Who else would buy such a thing? Well, Hamish said, scratching his ear, I was thinking about that silver key I found in Mr. Sterling's pocket. It had a little tag on it, very faint, with the letters H.R. on it. Now Miss Halberton Smythe, mentioned the house used to be called the Highland Rose. I wonder if that key fits an old lock that Mr. Sterling didn't even know existed. A secret way in, perhaps? One that a local lad like Peter wouldn't know about, but someone with a sense of history might. Blair scoffed, though the fire had gone out of his eyes. A secret key? This isn't a Gothic novel, Macbeth. It's a murder investigation. But if you're so sure this boy is innocent, who killed him? Give me a name or get out of my sight. I'm working on it, sir, Hamish lied smoothly. I just need to check a few more details, village gossip and the like. Very unreliable, as you always say. Blair waved him away with a growl of dismissive anger. Get out. And take the boy with you before I change my mind. But if I don't have a suspect by morning, Macbeth, I'm holding you personally responsible for the lack of progress. You'll be walking a beat in the rain-soaked docks of Aberdeen before you can say poached salmon. Hamish ushered a sobbing Peter out of the room and into the relatively fresh air of the station foyer. He didn't stay to offer comfort. He didn't have the time. The revelation about the bag and the receipt confirmed his suspicion. The killer was planting evidence. They knew exactly how the local police operated, and they knew Blair's temperament. They had expected an easy scapegoat to end the matter quickly. As he walked Peter toward the door, Hamish's mind returned to the Highland Rose and the partner Sterling had betrayed. If the killer was Mr. Smith from the hotel, he was playing a very clever game. But the backward kilt was the key. It was too specific, too steeped in a particular kind of educated resentment. It wasn't the work of a man who just wanted his money back. It was the work of a man who wanted to reclaim a legacy. Hamish watched Peter scurry away toward his mother's cottage, then he turned his gaze toward the dark, looming silhouette of the hills. Somewhere out there, the real killer was watching the police lights, likely laughing at the spectacle. Hamish whistled for lugs, his jaw tightening. The time for mooching tea was over. He needed to find Elspeth Grant and the true history of the Highland Rose before the killer decided that a meddling village policeman was the next person who needed to be taught a lesson in Highland tradition. "Come on, lugs," Hamish muttered, climbing back into the Land Rover. "We've got a ghost to find, and I've a feeling he's not nearly as dead as the records say." He pulled away from the station, leaving the glow of Blair's rage behind him, heading deep into the gathering shadows of the glen where the secrets of the past were finally beginning to bleed into the present. The Land Rover's headlights cut through the thickening haar like two weak yellow eyes as Hamish navigated the road toward the small cottage where Elspeth Grant lived. The encounter in the interview room had left a sour taste in his mouth. Blair's eagerness to ruin a boy's life for the sake of a quick arrest was a reminder of why Hamish avoided the career ladder. The higher one climbed, the less one seemed to care about the people on the ground. He parked on the verge, the engine ticking as it cooled, and walked up the stone path. Elspeth was already at the door, her face illuminated by the warm glow of a desk lamp. She looked like she had been expecting him. Or perhaps she simply knew that in Loch Dhu, a murder always eventually led to her door for the history of the thing. "You've come about the Highland Rose, I assume," she said, stepping aside to let him into the small book-lined room. "I saw the way Blair's team was tearing up the village. I take it they haven't found the Mr. Smith who checked out of the hotel?" "They haven't even looked for him, Elspeth," Hamish said, dropping into a chair that smelled of old paper and lavender. Blair had his heart set on Peter Macpherson because of a receipt and an orange bag. "I've managed to stall him, but only just. Tell me about the family that lived at the rest. Priscilla said there was a scandal. Elspeth sat opposite him, pulling a thick folder onto her lap. It was more than a scandal, Hamish. It was a tragedy of the old Burr sort. The house belonged to the MacIvors. They were an old family, not wealthy in the modern sense, but they held the land for 300 years. In the late 90s, the father, Alastair MacIvor, got involved in a development scheme. He wanted to preserve the estate, and he was promised a partnership that would turn the grounds into a sustainable forestry project. The man who approached him was a young, ruthless city slicker named Julian Sterling. Mish sat up straighter, his tiredness forgotten. Sterling, 30 years ago? He was just starting out, Elspeth explained, her finger tracing a yellowed newspaper clipping. He tricked Alastair into signing the house title as collateral. Then he intentionally crashed the project, bought the debt for pennies, and evicted the family. Alastair's wife, Morag, couldn't bear the shame of seeing the ancestral home turned into a commercial asset. She took her life on the cliffs below the garden. Alastair disappeared shortly after. There was a son, too, a boy named Ian. He would be in his early 40s now, BRH. Mish looked at the photo in the clipping. It was a grainy shot of a tall, thin boy with a defiant expression, standing in front of the gates of the Highland Rose. A tall man with a tan, Hamish whispered, recalling Nellie's description of the mysterious guest in room 4. If Ian Macbeth came back to Lochdu, he wouldn't look like a local. He'd look like an outsider, a man who had spent his life away but kept the Highlands in his blood, and he'd know about the secret entrance. That silver key you mentioned, Elspeth said, matches the description of the old service keys for the Rose. There's a passage from the sea caves up into the cellar of the house. It was used for smuggling in the 18th century and kept as a curiosity. To anyone else, it's just a legend. To a MacIvor, it's the back door to their own home. His motive was no longer a petty dispute over a right-of-way or a business deal gone wrong. It was something far more visceral, the reclamation of a stolen legacy and the punishment of the man who had driven a mother to her death. The "See You Jimmy" hat and the backward kilt weren't just insults, they were a commentary on what Sterling had done to the Highland identity. He had turned a family's history into a cheap, marketable commodity, and the killer had returned the favour in kind. But why now? Hamish asked, his brow furrowed. Why wait 30 years? Because Sterling only recently moved back to Lochdu, Elspeth replied. He spent decades in London and abroad. Coming back to the rest, the very house he stole, was the final insult. It was like a murderer returning to the scene of the crime to boast. Ian, or whoever this man is, must have been waiting for the moment Sterling felt most secure. Hamish stood up, his mind churning. He saw the logic, but he also saw the danger. If the killer was Ian MacIvor, he wasn't a common criminal. He was a man driven by a sense of righteous vengeance. He had framed Peter not out of malice toward the boy, but because he knew Blair would fall for the most obvious bait, giving the real killer time to finish whatever he had started. Where would he go, Elspeth? If he reclaimed the house and killed the usurper, what's left? The cliffs, Elspeth said softly. It's where it ended for his mother. If he's as steeped in the old ways as the kilt suggests, he'll want to finish the cycle where it began. Hamish thanked her and hurried back to the Land Rover, Lug scrambling into the passenger seat with an expectant whine. The fog was finally beginning to tear apart under a rising wind from the Atlantic, revealing a moon that hung like a cold white eye over the loch. He didn't head for the police station to tell Blair. The DCI would only bring a small army and turn a delicate situation into a bloodbath. Besides, Blair was likely still in the bar of the hotel, celebrating his almost arrest of Peter. As he drove back toward the cliffs of the Widow's Rest, Hamish felt a strange sense of kinship with the man he was hunting. He too loved this land with a fierce, quiet intensity. He understood the rage that came when outsiders tried to strip the soul from the hills. But murder was murder, and the law, however imperfectly represented by men like Blair, had to be upheld, or at least it had to be managed. He pulled the Land Rover to a stop several hundred yards from the villa's gates, dousing the lights. The house was dark, a jagged silhouette against the stars. He could hear the roar of the sea below, a rhythmic, hungry sound. He reached into his pocket and felt the silver key he had borrowed from the evidence bag before Blair could notice its significance. He wouldn't go through the front door. He would go through the caves, tracing the path of the ghosts that still haunted the Highland Rose. He had to find Ian MacIver before the man took the final step off the edge, and he had to do it in a way that kept the truth of Loch Dhu safe from the prying, clumsy hands of the Strathbane CID. The trap was half set in his mind. He just needed the killer to believe that the stupid policeman was still back in the village, nursing a cup of tea. He stepped out into the wind, the scent of salt and heather filling his lungs, and began the descent toward the shore. His descent toward the shore was a treacherous crawl through gorse and slick, rain-heavy bracken. Hamish moved with the practiced stealth of a man who had spent many a midnight outwitting the local gamekeepers, his boots finding purchase on the jagged gneiss where a less experienced man would have surely broken an ankle. Luggs followed with an eerie, silent grace, his nose twitching at the scent of salt and the cold, metallic tang of the rising tide. The wind had picked up, whipping the Har into tattered ribbons, and revealing the jagged maw of the sea caves that honeycombed the cliffs beneath the villa. These were the foundations of the MacIver Legabra Bar. Sigh, cold and indifferent to the dramas of the men who built atop them. Hamish reached the narrow strip of shingle beach and paused, his ears straining over the thunder of the Atlantic. There, tucked behind a pillar of rock, was a small inflatable rib boat, its engine still warm enough to tick. It wasn't the vessel of a casual tourist. It was sleek, black, and professional, the sort of craft a man would use if he intended to vanish into the vastness of the Minch once his business was concluded. Hamish felt the silver key in his pocket, its edges sharp against his palm. He moved toward the dark opening of the central cave, where the walls were slick with algae and the air felt heavy with the weight of the earth above. He didn't use his torch. Instead, he relied on the faint ambient light of the moon reflecting off the water, moving deeper into the throat of the cliff. After 50 paces, the floor began to slope upward, and the smell of the sea was replaced by the dry, musty scent of ancient masonry. His hand brushed against a wooden door, reinforced with iron bands and half hidden behind a fall of loose rock. He inserted the silver key. It turned with a smooth, oiled click that spoke of recent maintenance. Ian MacIver hadn't just returned. He had been preparing for this stage for a long time. The door swung open, revealing a narrow spiral staircase of damp stone. Hamish heard a sound from far above, the rhythmic, hollow thud of someone pacing on floorboards. It was a slow dbr-bar, illiberate sound, lacking the frantic energy of a man in flight. It was the sound of someone waiting. Hamish began the climb, his heart thumping a steady rhythm against his ribs. He knew he was walking into a trap, or perhaps an audience, but he also knew that Blair was currently 3 miles away, likely ordering a third whiskey and basking in the false glory of having cracked the case. Hamish was on his own, exactly where he preferred to be. He emerged through a concealed panel in the library of the Widow's Rest, or the Highland Rose, as the house seemed to demand being called in the shadows of the night. The room was vast and cold, stripped of Stirling's modern, soulless furniture. In the centre of the room, standing by the tall windows that looked out over the cliff's edge, was the man from room 4. In the moonlight he looked older than the boy in the newspaper clipping, his face etched with the hard lines of a man who had survived by his wits in far-flung places. But the defiance in his posture was identical. He was dressed not in a suit, but in a heavy woolen jumper and dark trousers, looking every bit the Highland son he was. "You're late, Constable," the man said, not turning. His voice was cultured, but the lilt of the north was beneath it, like a stone under a shallow stream. "I expected you an hour ago. You're the one they call Macbeth, the one who plays the fool to keep the peace. I must admit you played your part well in the village, but you were too fast for DCI. You shouldn't have cleared the postman so early." "Peter's a good lad," Hamish said, stepping fully into the room, Luggs sitting alertly at his side. "He's got a mother to look after. I couldn't have let him take the fall for a man who knows the difference between a real tartan and a tourist's rag." "You're Ian MacIver, I take it? Or do you prefer Mr. Smith, The man turned then, a faint, sad smile touching his lips. "I prefer Ian Smith was a necessity. I wanted Julian to know who was coming for him, but I didn't want the bureaucracy of Strathbane to interfere with a family matter." Sterling was a thief, Macbeth. He didn't just steal a house, he stole a soul. He broke my father and he killed my mother as surely as if he'd pushed her himself. Do you know what he said to me last night, before I did it? He didn't remember the name Macivor. He thought I was another frustrated investor. He'd ruined so many lives he'd lost count of the faces. "Oh, you killed him," Hamish said quietly, "and you dressed him up. Why the see you Jimmy hat, Ian? Why the backward kilt? It's a bit theatrical for a man of your experience, is it not?" But first, N walked toward a small table where a bottle of expensive malt whisky sat uncorked. He poured 2 glasses and held one. It was justice, Constable. He viewed this land as a theme park, a place of quaint caricatures and easy profit. So I made him the ultimate caricature. I gave him exactly what he thought we were, a mockery, a man with no clan, no honour, and a peel astic head of hair. It was the only language he would have understood in his final moments. Hamish took the glass but didn't drink. "And the key, the receipt? You wanted me to find those. You wanted Blair to chase his tail while you made your exit. But you underestimated one thing, Ian. You underestimated how much I hate seeing my village turned into a circus. You've brought the law down on Loch Dhu like a hammer, and now I've got to find a way to stop it from crushing the innocent." "You've already stopped it," Ian said, gesturing toward the window. "The boat is ready. By dawn, I'll be miles away, and you'll have a dead villain and a missing suspect. You can tell them I overpowered you. You can tell them I escaped into the fog. Blair will be furious, but he'll have his body, and eventually he'll find a way to blame the incompetent local policeman for the escape. You keep your quiet life, and I keep my peace." "It's a tempting offer," Hamish mused, his eyes scanning the room. He noticed a small, leather-bound book on the desk, a family Bible, its pages worn thin. "But there's a problem. I'm a policeman, Ian. A lazy one, maybe, and one who likes his sleep. But I canna just let a murderer sail into the sunset. It sets a bad precedent. The sheep would never respect me again." Ian's expression hardened, and for the first time Hamish saw the flash of the Iron Gnome's brutality in the man's eyes. "I don't want to hurt you, Macbeth. You're a man of the hills. You understand why this had to happen. But I am leaving this house one way or another. My mother's spirit is finally at rest, and I won't spend the remainder of my life in a stone cell because a man like Sterling lacked a conscience." Hamish sighed, a long, weary sound that seemed to fill the empty library. He set the whiskey glass down on the desk, his movements slow and deliberate. "I was afraid you'd say that. You see, Ian, you've been very clever, but you've been away too long. You've forgotten that in the Highlands we don't just listen to what people say. We listen to what they don't say. And you haven't said a word about the silver key I found in Sterling's pocket, the one you supposedly used to get in." Ian frowned, his hand twitching toward the heavy brass paperweight on the desk. "I don't follow you. The key I found in his pocket wasn't the one you used," Hamish said, his voice dropping into a low, dangerous rumble. "The key in his pocket was a plant. You put it there to lead me to the caves. But the real key to the rose, the one that actually fits the service door, is still hanging on the hook in the kitchen of the hotel, where you stole it from the old housekeeper's board. You see, Ian, you're not the only one who knows this house's history. But you are the only one who forgot I have been a cop here for 10 years. I know every lock in this parish, and I know the key is Sterling's pocket. Well, it actually fits the evidence locker back at the station. I swapped them while Blair shouting at Peter. Ian stared at him, the realization dawning that the very man he had dismissed as a rustic simpleton had outplayed him. You lured me here." "No," Hamish said, a small, grim smile appearing on his face. "I let you believe you were luring me. Now, you can either come back with me and tell the truth, which, given the circumstances and Sterling's reputation, might get you a sympathetic jury, or you can try to reach that boat. But I should warn you, Luggs hasn't had his dinner yet, and he's a terrible habit of biting the heels of men who run." The tension in the room was a physical weight, a silent battle of wills between the man who had sought vengeance and the man who sought balance. Outside, the wind howled against the glass, a wild Highland lament for the secrets that were finally coming to light. Hamish stood his ground, his lanky frame deceptively relaxed, waiting for the moment the killer would realize that in Loch Dhu, the slow and the lazy were often the most dangerous of all. He wasn't just a policeman, he was the spirit of the place, and he had no intention of letting Ian Macivor turn his home into a graveyard. Silence in the library of the Highland Rose was brittle, a thin sheet of ice ready to shatter under the weight of a single footfall. Ian MacIver stared at Hamish, his eyes darting from the constable's calm, weather-beaten face to the low-slung, growling shadow that was Lugs. The realization that his carefully constructed narrative, tale of a vengeful ghost slipping through ancient tunnels, had been dismantled by a simple switch of keys seemed to age him in an instant. He had played a grand game of chess against the ghost of his past, only to find that the local Bobby had been playing a much more grounded game of three-card Monty right under his nose.
"You're a clever man, Macbeth,"
Ian said, his voice now devoid of its earlier theatricality. He shifted his weight, his fingers brushing the heavy brass paperweight on the desk. "Too clever for this place. Why do you stay? Why protect the memory of a man like Stirling? He was a parasite. The world is better without him. The world might be," Hamish replied, his voice soft but carrying the weight of an anvil. "But Loch Dhu isn't. We have peace here, Ian. It's a fragile thing, built on knowing which secrets to keep and which laws to bend. When you killed Stirling, you didn't just kill a man. You invited the whole world into our living room. You invited men like Blair to stomp through our gardens and put our lads in cages. I'm not protecting Stirling's memory. I'm protecting the people you've put in the path of the storm." Ian's hands suddenly closed around the brass paperweight. "I'm not going to a cell, Macbeth, not after all these years of waiting. I've breathed the air of 5 continents, but none of it tasted as sweet as the air here tonight. I won't let you take that away." In one fluid motion, Ian lunged. He didn't aim for the door. He swung the heavy ass weight toward Hamish's temple, with a desperation born of 30 years of festering rage. Hamish, despite his lanky frame and the appearance of slow-witted laziness, moved with the startling speed of a striking adder. He ducked the blow, the brass whistling through the air where his head had been a second before, and stepped into Ian's guard. He didn't use a punch. He used a shepherd's leverage, grasping Ian's wrist and twisting it with a strength that came from years of wrestling recalcitrant rams and hauling heavy nets. Ian gasped as the paperweight clattered to the floor. Lugs was instantly on his feet, a blur of fur and teeth, snapping at Ian's heels with a series of sharp, authoritative barks that filled the room like gunfire. Ian tried to break free, kicking out with his heavy boots, but Hamish bore him down to the floor, using his weight to pin the smaller man against the cold boards of the library. "Easy now, Ian," Hamish grunted, his face mere inches from the killer's. "It's over. You've had your say, and you've had your revenge. Don't add a dead policeman to the tally. It'll only make the trial longer, and I've a terrible dislike for sitting in courtrooms." Ian struggled for a moment longer. Then his body seemed to go limp, the fight draining out of him as if a plug had been pulled. He let out a long, ragged sob, a sound that wasn't for Julian Stirling, but for the mother who had died on the rocks below and the father who had died a broken man in a nameless London. Flat. Hamish maintained his grip for a heartbeat longer, then slowly released him, though he stayed close enough to intercept any further madness. "I just wanted to be home," Ian whispered into the dust of the floorboards. "I just wanted the Rose to be ours again." "It is yours in a way," Hamish said, standing up and brushing the dust from his trousers. He looked around the dark, hollowed-out room. "But a house built on blood is a cold place to sleep. You should have just let the village handle him. We have our ways of making men like Stirling move on. A few flat tires, a few missed deliveries, a cold shoulder at the bar. Eventually they realize they're not welcome, and they find somewhere else to be important. You didn't have to kill him, Ian. You just had to wait." Hamish pulled a pair of heavy iron handcuffs from his belt, a piece of equipment he rarely used and constantly forgot to oil. They ratcheted shut with a grim, final sound. He felt no triumph, only a deep, abiding weariness. He looked toward the window where the first hints of a cold, grey dawn were beginning to bleed into the eastern sky. The storm was passing, but the wreckage remained to be cleared. "We need to go," Hamish said, pulling Ian to his feet, "before the sun comes up and the forensic boys start crawling all over the grounds again. I've a plan, Ian, one that might keep Peter Macpherson out of the papers and keep the Strathbane CID from declaring martial law on Loch Dhu." "Why would you help me, Ian, but asked, his voice hollow. "I'm not helping you," Hamish said, leading him toward the concealed panel in the wall. "I'm helping the village. and I'm making sure that certain people get the credit they think they deserve. If Blair thinks he's the one who caught you, he'll be so busy preening for the cameras that he won't look too closely at the details. And the details are what keep a man like me in a job like this. They descended the spiral staircase in silence, the only sound the scrape of boots on stone and the distant fading roar of the sea. When they reached the bottom, Hamish didn't take Ian to the boat. Instead, he led him through the damp sea cave and back up the treacherous cliff path toward the Land Rover. He needed to move fast. He needed to be back at the police station before Blair's morning hangover kicked in, and he needed to ensure that the story told to the world was one that suited the needs of Loch Dhu. As they reached the vehicle, Hamish looked back at the Highland Rose. In the pre-dawn light, the house looked less like a monument to tragedy and more like an old, tired building in need of a good cleaning. The widow's rest was gone, and the Rose was a memory. He loaded Ian into the back of the Land Rover, Lugs jumping in beside him to act as a silent, furry jailer. "You'll tell them about the gnome?" Ian asked as Hamish turned the key. "I'll tell them everything they need to know," Hamish replied, watching the yellow headlights flicker across the gorse. "And nothing they don't." "That's the way of things here, Ian. You should have remembered that before you bought that See You Jimmy hat. It was the hat that did you in. Too much London theatre and not enough Highland common sense." He drove away from the cliffs, the Land Rover bumping and swaying over the familiar road. The investigation was almost over, but the most difficult part was yet to come, convincing DCI Blair that he had been a brilliant detective all along, and ensuring that Hamish Macbeth remained exactly where he was, at the bottom of the ladder, in the quietest corner of the world with a pot of coffee and a dog who didn't care about the law. He had a few more cards to play, and as the lights of Loch Dhu appeared through the receding mist, Hamish began to rehearse his most convincing stupid face. He had a suspect, he had a motive, and most importantly, he had a way to make it all go away before the tourists arrived for the weekend. The Land Rover rolled into the sleeping village of Loch Dhu, just as the first cold light of morning began to turn the mist from grey to a ghostly translucent white. Hamish did not pull up to the front of the police station where the Strathbane cars were already beginning to stir with the arrival of the morning shift. Instead, he took the back lane, parking behind the old smiddy where the shadows were deepest. He looked into the rearview mirror at Ian MacIver. The man sat slumped, the defiance that had carried him across continents finally extinguished by the damp, heavy air of his birthplace. The handcuffs gleamed dully in the dawn. "Now, Ian," Hamish said, his voice a low, steady hum, "listen close, for I'm only going to say this once. When we walk through that door, you're going to find a man named Detective Chief Inspector Blair. He's a loud man, a rude man, and a man who believes he is the smartest person in any room he happens to inhabit. You are going to let him believe it. You will tell him that you were lurking in the village, waiting for your moment, and that it was his brilliant deduction regarding the hotel registry and the Mr. Smith alias that forced you out of hiding. You will tell him that you tried to flee, but his strategic placement of officers, meaning me, blocked your escape." Ian looked up, a flicker of confusion crossing his weary face. "You want me to give him the credit, but he didn't do anything. He was going to ruin that boy's life." "Exactly," Hamish muttered, opening the driver's side door. "If Blair takes the credit, he gets the promotion he's been shouting about for 3 years. If he gets the promotion, he goes back to Strathbane or, God willing, Glasgow, and stays out of our hair. More importantly, if he thinks he's solved it, he won't go looking for the details I've spent the night tidying up. He won't ask why the kilt was backward, and he won't ask about the history of the Highland Rose. He'll just see a closed file and a career boost. Do you understand?" Ian nodded lowly, a grim smile touching his lips. "You're a devious man, Macbeth. You'd have made a better smuggler than a policeman. I'm just a man who likes his peace, Ian. Now let's go and make a big man very happy." Hamish led his prisoner through the station's back entrance. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of stale coffee and the frantic clicking of a typewriter. DCI Blair was in the main office, his tie loosened and his face a map of exhaustion and irritation. He was currently berating D.S. Anderson over a missing forensic report when Hamish walked in, gently nudging Ian MacIver ahead of him. "Excuse me, Inspector," Hamish said, his voice shifting back into that slow, rhythmic Highland drawl that suggested a mind perpetually stuck in second gear. He wiped a bit of mud from his sleeve and put on his most vacant, apologetic expression. "I'm sorry to be interrupting your morning, sir. I know you're a busy man with the weight of the world on your shoulders." Blair turned. His eyes narrowed. "What is it now, Macbeth? I told you to stay out of the way. I'm in the middle of coordinating a multi-agency manhunt for the Mr. Smith character, provided he actually exists." "Oh, he exists surely, sir," Hamish said, gesturing to Ian. "This here is the gentleman you were looking for. I found him down by the old jetty, just like you suggested. You remember yesterday when you told me to keep a sharp eye on the coast? Well, I did just that. And sure enough, there he was, trying to eke off in a black boat. He saw me and realized you had the whole perimeter sewn up tight. So he gave himself up. Said there was no point running when a man of your reputation was on the case." Blair froze. He looked at Ian MacIver, then at the handcuffs, then back at Hamish. The silence in the room was absolute as the DCI's brain worked to reconcile his own total lack of progress with this sudden, miraculous gift. Slowly the purple hue of rage began to recede from his neck, replaced by a radiant, self-satisfied glow. He puffed out his chest, his thumbs finding the armholes of his waistcoat. "Brr, is that so?" Blair asked, his voice suddenly booming with newfound authority. He walked over to Ian, circling him like a predator who had just found a pre-killed meal. "So, Smith, or whatever your name is, you thought you could slip past my net, did you? You didn't realize I'd accounted for the jetty. I've been tracking your psychological profile since I arrived in this godforsaken village." And looked at Hamish, saw the subtle nod, and then turned to Blair. "The constable is right. I thought I had a chance until I heard you were in charge of the investigation. Your reputation precedes you, Inspector. I knew it was only a matter of time before you put the pieces together. The hotel, the alias, it was all too much for a man of your caliber. Bruh." Blair's grin was wide enough to be painful. He clapped a hand on Anderson's shoulder, nearly knocking the sergeant over. "You hear that, Jimmy? RBR. Brah. Assaults. That's what real detective work gets you. Macbeth, you did well to follow my orders for once. It's a pity you don't have the initiative to do this kind of thing on your own, but at least you can follow a superior officer's lead." "I try my best, sir," Hamish said, casting his eyes to the floor in a show of humble incompetence. "Though I'm sure I'd be lost without your guidance. Will you be wanting me to handle the paperwork, or will you be taking over the interrogation now? I wouldn't want to overstep." "Paperwork? Don't be ridiculous," Blair snapped, already reaching for the telephone. "I'm calling the chief constable. This is a high-profile collar, Macbeth. I'll be handling the statement personally. You, get this man into the cell and then go find me some decent coffee. Not that instant swill you keep in the back. Get it from the hotel." "Of course, sir." "Right away, sir," Hamish said, leading Ian away. As they passed into the hallway toward the cells, Hamish caught Anderson's eye. The sergeant gave him a long, knowing look, one that acknowledged the sheer, breathtaking audacity of the lie, but he said nothing. Anderson, too, wanted Blair gone, and a shared secret was the strongest bond in the police force. Once Ian was safely behind the bars, Hamish paused. The heavy iron door felt like a final period at the end of a long, bloody sentence. Through the small barred window, he could see the village beginning to wake. Smoke was rising from the chimneys, and the sound of the morning bus could be heard climbing the hill. "You'll be all right, Ian," Hamish whispered. "The lawyers will have a field day with Sterling's history. There's enough dirt on that man to bury the rose 10 times over. You might find the Highlands are more forgiving than you think." "Thank you, Hamish," Ian said, his voice barely audible. "For the house, for the silence." Hamish didn't answer. He turned and walked back into the main office, where Blair was already loudly explaining to a superior over the phone how he had personally cornered the suspect after a grueling tactical pursuit. Hamish lifted his cap and whistled for Luggs, who was waiting by the door. He walked out into the crisp morning air, the scent of peat smoke and salts greeting him like an old friend. He didn't go to the hotel for Blair's coffee. Instead, he walked toward the loch, his long legs eating up the distance. He had a date with a salmon that had been interrupted 24 hours ago, and he had a feeling that after the day he'd had, the fish would be practically jumping into his net. He had saved a boy's future, sent a killer to a justice that made sense, and most importantly, he had ensured that he wouldn't be promoted any time soon. To the world, he was just PC Hamish Macbeth, the lazy Bobby of Loch Dhu, who couldn't find his own socks without help. And as he watched the sun finally break through the clouds, reflecting off the silver water, Hamish knew that was exactly the way it should be. The foe. Lowing morning, the sun rose over Loch Dubh with a rare golden clarity that seemed to scrub the village clean of the previous day's shadows. The white and blue police vans had vanished, leaving only a few deep ruts in the gravel of the hotel drive as a reminder of the Strathbane invasion. DCI Blair had departed in a whirlwind of self-congratulation, his black sedan nearly airborne as he sped toward the city to present his masterful findings to the press. He hadn't even finished his coffee, which suited Hamish Macbeth just fine, as it meant there was more for him. Hamish sat on the bench outside his police station, his long legs stretched out before him and his face turned toward the warmth. Lugs lay across his boots, occasionally twitching an ear at the sound of the gulls. The air was peaceful, filled only with the rhythmic clink-clink of the blacksmith's hammer from down the lane, a sound that was now a comfort rather than a source of suspicion. "You look far too content for a man who almost lost his job yesterday, Hamish," a voice called out. Priscilla Halberton Smythe was walking across the square, a basket of eggs on her arm and a knowing smile on her face. She paused before him, her eyes scanning the quiet street. "I hear the hero of the hour has returned to Strathbane to receive his laurels," she said softly. "The papers are already calling it a triumph of traditional policing. They say Blair identified the suspect through a brilliant analysis of local geography." Hamish took a slow, deliberate sip of his coffee, his expression one of perfect, bovine innocence. "Och, the inspector is a grand man for geography, Priscilla. He has a way of seeing things that a simple man like myself would never dream of. It's a gift, surely. I'm just glad he was here to show us how it's done. If it had been left to me, I'd likely still be scratching my head over that backward kilt." Priscilla laughed, a bright, clear sound. "And I suppose the fact that the Highland Rose is currently being tied up in a legal trust for the MacIver descendants, thanks to some anonymous documents delivered to the local solicitor, is also a piece of Blair's brilliance." Hamish tilted his cap over his eyes. "The law is mysterious, Priscilla. Documents appear, documents disappear. It's like the hair, you can't really tell where it comes from, only that it changes the landscape when it arrives." He watched as Peter the Postie cycled past, waving a cheerful hand. The boy looked 10 years younger, his whistle echoing through the salty air. The orange bag was gone, replaced by a sturdy leather satchel, and the fear that had clouded his face had been replaced by the easy confidence of a lad who knew he belonged. The village had closed ranks, the secret of Ian MacIver's true return absorbed into the collective silence of the glen. To the world, a stranger named Smith had killed a developer. To Loch Dubh, the Rose had simply defended itself. "Ill you be coming up to the big house for bar. Dinner tonight?" Priscilla asked, turning to leave. "My father wants to thank you for keeping the riffraff in check, though I suspect he just wants to complain about the price of kilt pins." "I'd like that, Priscilla," Hamish said, "but I've a pot of stew on the stove that's been simmering since Tuesday, and a book on the history of Sutherland that's calling my name. A man in my position canna be seen dallying with the gentry too often, or people might start thinking I've got ambitions." "Heaven forbid," she teased, walking away toward the hotel. Hamish watched her go, then stood up and stretched, his joints popping like dry kindling. He whistled for lugs and retreated into the cool, quiet interior of the station. The kettle was already singing on the hob, and the smell of slow-cooked mutton and onions filled the small kitchen. It was a modest life, a lazy life by some standards, but as he sat at his scarred wooden table and began to ladle the stew into a bowl, Hamish felt a profound sense of balance. The Sassenach developer was gone, the Highland Rose was silent, and the big men from the city were occupied with their medals and their microphones. Out in the loch, the salmon were leaping, and in the hills, the heather was turning a deep, royal purple. Hamish Macbeth had done his duty. He had caught the killer, protected the innocent, and managed to look entirely useless while doing it. He sat down, broke off a piece of crusty bread, and shared a bit of meat with lugs. The peace of Loch Dubh had returned, and for now, that was all the reward he required. Tomorrow there might be a poached deer to investigate, or a missing tractor, or a dispute over a garden fence. Today there was only the sun, the stew, and the sweet, uncomplicated silence of the Highlands.